Welcome to Qualified Opinions, where we test the ideas and limits, the knowns and known unknowns around freedom and order in contemporary politics and society. We invite you to listen as we engage with leading and emerging thinkers across disciplines and issues who will sharpen our thinking on the topics shaping our discourse. It's my pleasure to welcome Adam White to the Qualified Opinion podcast. Adam is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and the co-director of the Scalia Law School, Boyden Gray Center for the Study of the Administrative State. Today, we're going to talk about the top antitrust cop, Lina, and how while she started her career only 12 years ago at the age of 22, she's now the chairwoman of the Federal Trade Commission, the darling of the progressive left and hence the media, and how she is taking a knife to the precedents that have guided our approach to antitrust for nearly 50 years. Welcome, Adam.
Well, it's great to be here. Thanks.
So before we start, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you ended up studying the administrative state.
Yeah.
I mean, the legal studies, there's just, I assume, enormous choice, enormous field you could have got into. So tell us how you decided to study what you are studying now.
Well, in a nutshell, I didn't expect to be doing any of this. I went to law school ready to be a lawyer, probably an antitrust or corporate lawyer. Wound up getting very lucky with a clerkship for a great judge on the D.C. Circuit, Judge Santel, where I literally drew the short straw and had to handle the FERC energy cases for the first couple months. And much to my surprise, realized I loved those cases. I had no plans of really being an administrative law regulatory guy other than antitrust, I guess, but wound up really falling in love with it. So I spent about 6 years at a large law firm in D.C., Baker Botts, doing mostly energy regulatory work, and then left to help C. Boyden Gray, the late great C. Boyden Gray, start up a litigation shop in D.C., Boyden Gray and Associates, where I helped him on matters ranging from financial regulation to environmental regulation and more. And the more I got involved in this broader set of constitutional and regulatory issues, and the more I got involved in public policy, and all along I'd been writing kind of as a hobby for magazines like the Weekly Standard and Commentary and the Wall Street Journal's book reviews, the more I got drawn into the world of think tanks. And so I left full-time practice, I guess about 9 years ago, to join the Hoover Institution, and a few years ago came to AEI with my friend Yuval Levin. And along the way, one last thing, as you mentioned, I was invited to help lead a program here at George Mason, the Antonin Scalia Law School, called the C. Boyden Gray Center for the Study of the Administrative State. And so here at AEI, I get to do my own writing on these regulatory issues. And at Scalia Law, I'm helping oversee a research center with Professor Jen Mascott, where we bring together scholars, litigators, and others to think and write and debate about administrative law.
Wow, that's great. So let's talk actually about your writing. Your latest article in Commentary magazine, I really, truly enjoyed it. It's called The Power Broke Her, and it's about the rise and you say maybe, in parentheses, the fall of the young FTC chairwoman, Lina Khan. What a spectacular career so far. Can you tell us about that?
Well, we should all be so lucky. She has had a meteoric rise. Just a little over a decade ago, she hadn't even been to law school yet. She was a young researcher at the New America Foundation, a program there, the Open Markets Center at New America. She goes on to Yale Law School, where she writes a series of really significant law review articles questioning the last 50 years of antitrust policy and law and urging basically a generational revolution in antitrust policy, specifically with an eye to companies like Amazon and other big tech companies.
Yes, her big article was the Amazon paradox, and I assume the paradox was that she really didn't like how Amazon was being run, but that consumers loved it. But we can talk about this later. Sorry.
No, that's all right. Yeah, and so she goes on to a career for a few years after graduating from law school, in and out of think tanks in Columbia Law School, working as a staffer at the Federal Trade Commission and at the House of Representatives on the committee that was investigating Amazon and the other tech companies on antitrust issues. As when President Biden is elected and inaugurated, he announces that Lina Khan would be one of his appointees or nominees to the Federal Trade Commission, which is a 5-member bipartisan commission. It's one of the great granddaddy of the big independent commissions, although I don't need to explain that to people listening to this podcast. And she gets nominated to just be a commissioner on the FTC. Her confirmation hearing is interesting, not particularly controversial. People knew that she had pretty strident views. But to the surprise of everybody, as soon as she was confirmed by the Senate, President Biden announced that she'd not be just one of 5 commissioners, she would be the chairwoman, where she immediately was in the driver's seat. I call her you mentioned before, she's the top antitrust cop. Maybe one could quibble with that and say the Justice Department's lead antitrust lawyer is just as much the top cop, and that's surely true.
Yeah.
But she has been a central figure both in her writings and kind of in her persona. As soon as her article got people's attention 5-6 years ago, she was immediately profiled in places like the Financial Times and elsewhere, really as the vanguard of modern antitrust policy. I don't mean to go on so long. I would just say she's a fascinating figure to write about. When Commentary asked me to write about her, I said I'd be glad to. I really wanted to take a deep dive into her ideas and the broader context of her ideas. But as you say at the end of the piece, I'm not saying she's just falling. I guess here's where I'm going with this. When I sat down to write the piece, there was a flurry of articles describing the FTC's major losses in cases against Microsoft and Meta. There was a lot of people suggesting that she was imploding, and not just conservative or libertarian critics, but folks on the center left who were raising real questions about her in places like the New York Times and New York Magazine. But the point of my article is actually, I think, in many ways, she's been a very successful figure at the FTC for reasons that I would disagree with. And I think that her greatest legacy is not going to be on antitrust policy, which the next administration could wipe away very quickly, but rather her style governance, her approach to ruling without rules, so to speak, is I think very consequential. And it marks a real generational turn in modern administration.
Yeah, so let's actually talk about what is the history of administrative law, and maybe through the history of the FTC. The FTC is like 110 years old, and I think kind of like the way I think about it, based on your article, and tell me. I mean, this is really not my area of expertise, but based on your article, they're kind of like, I can see like 2 main phases so far, and potentially we're heading towards a third one. Mm-hmm. And the first one is it was started, and it was kind of like there was just no real standard about how courts. There was a clear understanding that some power needed to be taken away from large companies, but a lot of power transferred to judges and regulators without a real standard. And then comes the Bork and law and economics revolution. Mm-hmm. And then that establishes a standard that I'd like you to elaborate about. And now basically what she's doing is she's kind of saying, that standard it doesn't work. We need to move away from this.
Yeah, let me take that in 2 chunks, and I'll start with administration broadly and then antitrust, because the stories overlap, but it's important to start with administration generally. And I'll be quick, I promise. But beginning in the mid-19th century or late 19th century, you get the creation of things like a Steamboat Regulatory Commission, and then most importantly, the Interstate Commerce Commission in 1887, the Federal Trade Commission a few decades after that. Big multi-member commissions. With very vague statutory mandates, right? To regulate railroads and the public convenience, or to regulate railroads to make sure that their rates and services are just and reasonable. In the case of the FTC, to regulate against monopolization. Very broad mandates for multi-member commissions that would mostly make policy on a case-by-case basis. They were originally created to kind of take the place of federal trial courts in many ways. By the time we get into the 20th century to the mid-20th century, you see an explosion of new agencies, and a lot of agencies that aren't multi-member commissions, but they're what we now think of as the EPA, which was created in the 1970s, but other agencies that have become very energetic. By the mid-20th century, after FDR and after the New Deal, the goal is to impose much more uniformity and order and process on these agencies. You get the Administrative Procedure Act of 1946. We just celebrated a couple of years ago its 75th anniversary. And an effort to encourage agencies to do more through rulemaking, especially what we call notice and comment rulemaking, making agencies a lot more like legislatures in a way. And they still adjudicate a lot of things on a case-by-case basis. And to that extent, the administrative law has tried to make them more court-like. And that's the story of administrative law. But at the same time, as you said, antitrust is a very important part of the story. Beginning a little over a century ago, you have the Federal Trade Commission, again, acting almost kind of like a court in deciding monopolization cases and other issues besides antitrust, trade practices on a case-by-case basis. By the mid-20th century, antitrust law is extremely open-ended. There's very little certainty from one case to the next as to what regulators or judges are actually going to do. So in the latter part of the 20th century, really coming out of the University of Chicago and also Yale, where Robert Bork was, you get scholars who are focused on two things. One is putting more economic rationality into antitrust policy. That's the law and economics movement. And also at the same time, sort of parallel to constitutional originalism, textualism, a spirit of conservative judicial restraint in which judges tried to constrain themselves to not be just open-ended policymakers. And so in antitrust, that both of those themes, law and economics and judicial restraint, are basically boiled down into what's known as the consumer welfare standard, where antitrust policy going forward would really center around what's best for consumers, particularly in terms of low prices. Low prices aren't the end-all, be-all. In theory, you could have predatory low prices that try to drive out competitors so that prices could then be raised. But basically, antitrust policy gets boiled down to what's called the consumer welfare standard. The point of my article is that Lina Khan and her colleagues, her compatriots, smart folks like Tim Wu at Columbia especially, they challenge the consumer welfare standard. They say it's a bad policy and also a bad reading of the antitrust statutes. And they're also, I say in the article, they're very wary of the spirit of self-restraint among regulators and antitrust judges alike. So the upshot of all of this is that they're both trying to change the basic vocabulary and criteria of administrative law. But underneath that, I think, is a pushback against checks and balances against the regulators themselves.
In your piece, you have a great quote, I think that summarizes well Bork's approach. You write, it argued that antitrust's goal should be the promotion of competition, its measure should be economic efficiency, and its hallmark should be the consumer welfare. I mean, yeah. I think it really kind of summarizes really well the approach. And of course, as an economist, it makes a lot of sense because, since Adam Smith, economists have understood that the point of activity is to use scarce resources as efficiently as possible to satisfy its consumer demand. And so can you tell us, before we go back to Lina Khan and her approach, can you tell us how transformative that embrace, it's a revolution really of the consumer welfare approach, a standard in antitrust. How transformative was it?
Well, it really was. You had in the mid-20th century, you had not just regulatory policy all over the place, you had judges deciding antitrust cases on a case-by-case basis, really without a uniform set of criteria that people could sort of identify in advance to know how proposed mergers and acquisitions would actually be governed and regulated. From the 1960s to the 1980s, you have first a vibrant economic or intellectual debate, again with folks like Bork and Manny, Ronald Coase, and on and on. By the 1980s, this really does settle into reforms institutionally through the appointment of new leaders at the FTC during the Reagan administration, and so on. Now, all this happens in the immediate aftermath of the 1970s, where the FTC really got out over its skis and was receiving pushback not just from the courts and the executive branch, but also by Congress, which legislated to hem in the FTC much more. But what's interesting is after the consumer welfare standard really became the centerpiece of antitrust ideas and then antitrust policy, it wasn't just a Republican policy. It really did receive a lot of, you could say, bipartisan or cross-ideological, cross-intellectual support. Not complete. I mean, the Chicago folks were, famously the leaders of this. Antitrust thinkers, especially at Harvard Law School, like Phil Arita and Yale and elsewhere, were not necessarily all as on board with everything that Bork and others were saying, but there was basically a consensus, much in the same way that, the Reagan administration in the 80s created cost-benefit analysis for regulations in general. They created the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. Again, my old boss, C. Boyden Gray, was deeply involved in that. And that, too, created a real bipartisan consensus that the Clinton administration built on in the aftermath of Reagan and Bush. So you had this coalescence around cost-benefit analysis and in antitrust, the consumer welfare standard. And so this new effort by this group, they call themselves the Neo-Brandesians. It's a reference to the late Justice Louis Brandeis. They are very explicitly pushing back against this consensus. And in her own writings, you see Kahn criticizing not just the Chicago School and Bork, but also the Harvard folks like Phil Arita and others who she sees as basically legitimizing what she saw at the outset to be illegitimate conservative or libertarian ideas.
So can you summarize what some of their criticism are? I mean, I know I've seen people say, and I don't know that Kahn is one of those pushing that line, but I wouldn't be surprised if she was, that it's all well and fine to have low prices, but the concentration of power is basically an affront to democracy. And there's a risk, which echoes, for me, arguments that I hear for the wealth tax, right? The idea that if you're wealthy, you have better access to power, and that will translate into an affront to democracy. But I don't know if she does this, but what are the main criticism that they have about the consumer welfare approach standard?
Let me give you three. And there's surely more, but these are the first three I'd focus on. The first is that the consumer welfare standard doesn't appear in the actual statutes that Congress passed. Congress outlawed monopolization and attempts to monopolize. It doesn't say anything about the consumer welfare standard. And one of the main arguments by Kahn and others is that Bork and others were oversimplifying Congress's intent in those statutes, that Bork was pushing a particular theory of Congress's intent that's much narrower than what Congress actually intended, and that it's unfairly narrowing the policy that Congress enacted. And I will say I think oftentimes that criticism is overstated. But, Bork, especially in his early articles and his book, The Antitrust Paradox, he did offer a particular account of Congress's legislative history that might well have been a little bit oversimplified. I think they read too much into that. They put too much weight on that part of his argument. But that's one of their arguments, that he is misreading the statute and its history. The second point is that they would say the consumer welfare standard oversimplifies competition too. That in order to judge whether markets are competitive, you can't just look at prices and as a proxy for consumer welfare. You need to look much more structurally at the market. You need to take a broader look at how the different players in a given market interact and compete. And you need to judge competition, not just in terms of prices and consumer welfare, but much more structurally. Now, I'd say one of the problems with this then is you get back to the problems of the mid-20th century. It's basically a totally open-ended, ex post facto judicial inquiry that you really don't have any certainty for up front. But that's their argument, that the consumer welfare standard oversimplifies the competition analysis. And then third, again, especially in the time that Lina Kahn begins writing, they argue that the consumer welfare standard is uniquely ill-suited to the modern problems of platform companies like Amazon who have significant power, they say, both over their customers and over their suppliers. That, say, Amazon, and you remember similar arguments years ago over, say, Walmart in small communities, that Walmart and now Amazon are uniquely powerful over not just consumers, but also over their suppliers. And at the same time, especially in the case of Amazon, as these companies become much more multifaceted, Amazon now sells everything plus TV, plus music, plus they are a logistics company, plus they are a cloud computing company, that kind of technological conglomeration poses unique challenges to modern antitrust policy. So those are the three main arguments. They'd say the consumer welfare standard is bad on the law, bad on the facts, and bad in modern circumstances.
So do you think that her main argument against it, do you think it's a rejection on the economics? Or do you think that ultimately it's a rejection based on a desire to be able to regulate more, to do more, to intervene more, to achieve a certain design for society? For instance, I remember in your piece, you talk about how Bohr comments that before the adoption of the consumer welfare standard, antitrust there was always this tension between protecting competition, but also protecting small businesses, right? And you hear this a lot. There's an aesthetic kind of side about, like big companies, they may provide low prices, but they destroy other things. So which one is it? Is it that she disagrees with the economics, or is it just really about power and to be able to achieve and to design and to mold society to something that she thinks it should be?
She says from time to time in interviews that antitrust policy isn't a silver bullet solution to all of society's problems. I think sometimes she indicates otherwise in the way she tries to actually carry things out. But she would say that she's not trying to change the world with antitrust policy. I think the best way to describe it, and I hate to put like words in her mouth, but I think the most charitable version of her argument, I think, would be that what she's trying to do is to reassert antitrust to prevent powerful private companies from deforming society. That antitrust is no longer a bulwark against private corporate power over consumers, workers, and others. And I should say, to her credit, when these antitrust laws were written in the late 19th century, as I said in the article, I don't think it's unfair to say it was almost a quasi-constitutional moment where Congress was trying to legislate broadly to constrain the power of the new industrial superpowers in America. I think that's a totally fair way to read it, and I think it's a very small r Republican account of antitrust. And Kahn oftentimes describes her approach as small r Republican. And so what she's trying to do, again, I think, is reassert antitrust to limit corporate power from deforming society, not just economically, but I think she would say socially. That the large corporations, their power over us is not just economic. It ends up changing the way we think and act in other aspects of our life. But my criticism of her is that in her pursuit of that reform, she is throwing away the internal checks and balances and self-restraint of antitrust law, that she is attempting a major transfer of power away from the private sector into the government sector, which I think is profoundly un-Republican, actually. That it's trying to make antitrust it's asking Americans to trust antitrust regulators with effectively unbounded discretion to save us from ourselves.
Yeah. So we've talked about what her criticism of the consumer welfare standard is, but so I'm still kind of unclear about what is it she wants to replace it with, because she's throwing away norms. I know that she dismissed the guideline that the FTC was following. What is she replacing all these with?
She's not replacing with a single standard. And I think she would say the point here is that the statutes themselves, the anti-monopolization statutes, they cannot be boiled down to a single criterion. And so she wants a much broader, she would say a much broader set of criteria, a much more, they would say, fact-sensitive, and I don't agree with them on that, but they say a much more fact-sensitive view of industry structure overall. The main thrust of my article is that by refusing to constrain themselves with clear ex-ante standards, and by repealing the ones that long-standing standards that the FTC has had in place, they are looking to leverage regulatory uncertainty to deter mergers, not so much by bringing and winning lawsuits against them, but by, as one of her former colleagues, Commissioner Noah Phillips, would say, imposing a regulatory tax on M&A through this regulatory uncertainty. I think that's what they're trying to do. So
in your article, you point that her tenure at the FTC so far hasn't been great if it's measured by her success in court. So she's endured two very, very big failure with Microsoft and Meta. And she has problem with her staff too, who don't seem to like her that much. As you had mentioned, you talked about the New York Magazine. I have a quote in there that says, Khan has become an object of over-the-top derision on the right, but the discontent of her tenure inside the FTC is broader and far less ideologically motivated than her defenders would have us believe. However, all that being said, the worries goes to that implicit tax that you're talking about, because your worry seems to be that it isn't so much about whether she wins in court, even though I guess at some point, if she loses everything, it's possibly going to be a problem. But the problem is that while she pretends that she wants to remove uncertainty, she is injecting so much uncertainty. And doesn't she define her success not with what she wins in court, but precisely because people, like businesses who were going to engage in mergers, are just deciding to just call it quit?
And on this point about discontent within the FTC, that's not just anecdotal. There were workplace satisfaction surveys, long-standing government surveys of agency workplace satisfaction, where the FTC's sort of internal job approval ratings within the agency staff have just plummeted under her.
Big turnover too, right?
Yeah, big turnover too. And now, to her credit, she hasn't lost everything. She had a major win in a case involving a biomedical company this year. But she's lost the two most high-profile cases so far, the Microsoft and Meta cases. They are now bringing cases against Amazon and Walmart, in which both companies are asserting huge constitutional claims against the FTC. One of the sort of no pun intended, but meta themes of the article is that the self-restraint approach that Bork and others championed through the consumer welfare standard might well have saved these open-ended statutes from constitutional challenge 50 years ago. And now Khan and others, by really pushing them further they've ever been pushing these boundaries of these laws, they are now leaving their targets, Amazon and Walmart especially, in the place of not just challenging the agency-specific decisions, but challenging the constitutionality of the statutes and the processes overall. We're recording this a few weeks after the Super Bowl, and I usually use a football metaphor. I say, Khan and her colleagues, they seem to think that they're playing a game where you can only gain yardage, and it was a fight over whether you might gain 3 yards or 10 yards or 50 yards. But it turns out they could get sacked too. They might end up losing yardage. The FTC might wind up having less power by the end of Lina Khan's tenure than when it started. But what I worry about the most, and this is the upshot at the end of the article, is that the FTC, let me put it this way, for 40, 50 years, conservative and libertarian critics of the administrative state have tended to focus on overregulation, understandably so, There are two, there are some of our colleagues at other think tanks. They count the number of rules, they count the pages in the Federal Register, they count the number of guidance documents. And these have all been important studies over the years. But what we're seeing now with Lina Khan is that some agencies, at least, can wield enormous power, not with a blizzard of regulations, but by repealing pre-existing rules. The other agency I focus on a lot with this is the Securities and Exchange Commission and the financial regulators, who seem much more energetic than ever before in imposing new regulatory policies, not through new regulations, although they're trying some of that, but especially the SEC, but trying to do more through enforcement. We've seen this with crypto, and I don't know where this podcast audience is on crypto. Tend to be a crypto skeptic myself, but I'm also a skeptic of the way the SEC has very passive aggressively approached crypto, with other financial regulators, the banking regulators, trying to do more policy making through the very nebulous framework for bank supervision. You're seeing more and more regulatory policy made not through rulemaking, but through these other nebulous policies. And I look at it all, and I tend to call it passive-aggressive administration, because it's not so much saying, here's our decision saying you can't do something. It's much foggier. It's much less accountable.
So are you worried? So in economics, I mean, one of the things we know that when we study businesses and the markets, right, is like the market doesn't like uncertainty. It leads to paralysis. And is this what you're worried about? It's like there's just such a randomness. You don't know. I mean, because guidelines aren't clear anymore. Mm-hmm. Are you worried that effectively what it does is like it freezes the sphere of innovation? It makes no difference between, you don't have any guidelines between what is a good merger, what is a bad one. And as a result, you have lots of good mergers that they're just not even attempted. Is that the worry you have is effectively, it's not so much that companies are going to be burdened under the weight of new rules, but that rather than risk having to face like a random lawsuit by litigation by the FTC or the SEC, mm-hmm. they're just going to abstain from innovating, really, or doing what they need to do.
That's a lot of it. And I come to this again as somebody who actually, practiced law for a dozen years. I mean, that's not a very long legal career, but it was enough.
Hey, it's the size of Lina Khan's entire career.
True. I understand from my former clients' perspectives that you might not like the new set of regulations, but once it's settled, at least you have some certainty. Conservatives are often very, very critical of guidance documents and so on, and especially when agencies use guidance documents to evade the notice and comment process. But as a practicing lawyer, my clients often love getting guidance directly from the agencies. They just wanted to know what the rules are. And what worries me about the current situation is, as you said, it'll maybe not it'll freeze some economic activity. It'll deter others. But this uncertainty, I think, has really terrible dynamics. First of all, it leaves companies having to focus not just on the immediate regulatory environment, but having to try to look over the horizon, keep using sports metaphors, maybe skate to where the puck is headed, trying to guess what's the long-term policy equilibrium, and then start making its way there. I think that undermines the efficacy of the rulemaking process and so on. But second, relatedly, it changes our approach to the rule of law. It's not so much the rule of law, it's a rule of regulatory uncertainty. And maybe the best example of how symptomatic this is in our economy now is that you have firms in Washington, D.C., like the Eurasia Group, that were created, years ago to study political risk in third world countries and emerging democracies. And now the Eurasia Group has a department focused on U.S. policy. My friend oversees it. Economists, political scientists, lawyers, they have to study the speeches, the off-the-cuff remarks of policymakers, the way you'd study foreign leaders to try to guess what they're thinking about regulation. And that's just no way to run a country. I'm not a maniac about this. I know there's always going to be vagueness and uncertainty in laws. Congress and legislatures can change laws. Agencies can change regulations. Laws and regulations are always going to have some vagueness that's going to leave some enforcement discretion. I understand all that, and I think it's important to take all of that seriously. But in our constitutional system, the best version of it is one in which Congress tries the best it can, reasonably, to write clear statutes. Then the executive branch does the best it can to further clarify the meaning of those laws, to further reduce legal uncertainty, always in a spirit of self-restraint. And then finally, the courts, at the end of the process, should further clarify and settle the meaning of laws. All three of those parts require a spirit of self-restraint in different ways. And again, what worries me so much about the current FTC is not so much antitrust policy. I'm not the antitrust nerd I thought I was going to be 25 years ago. But what worries me is the erasing of a spirit of self-restraint in government and replacing it with a spirit of again, I keep using the term, just the leveraging of regulatory uncertainty, which I think is very dangerous.
One of the things that I didn't see in your article, and I was surprised not to see in like the worries, and it occurred to me when you were talking about how transformative the consumer welfare standard was, and you gave us the history through the intellectual movement to the adoption, to it basically spreading and becoming kind of the accepted standard for most academics, and then agencies and the Clinton administration is like you don't actually talk about what Khan and Tim Wu and all these guys are doing. They really are starting a new legal movement. New, we can talk about that, whether it's really that new. It seems to me it's like a lot of old beliefs that are coming back, and they might as well. I mean, it's possible that in the same way as the consumer welfare standard has become the norm, basically right now she's losing in court because judges are using this standard to judge the cases that she presents. But it might be one day that actually the judges that will be hearing those litigations will be completely on board, because it will have become the way everyone thinks, and everyone thinks is normal.
Yeah. Well, you're right. I didn't focus much on that, and I'd already given my editors probably many thousands of words more than they expected in the first place. That's a good point. I mean, there's an irony in all of this that Khan, and especially Khan, but our colleagues, they criticize Bork and the rest of the Chicago school for, I think at one point, I can't remember the exact quote. I think in one article she describes it almost as a coup against the previous orthodoxy in antitrust law. She criticizes Bork and others for being revolutionaries, and now the neo-Brandesians are trying a revolution of their own. I think they don't often say this, but I think they draw as much inspiration from the history of the Chicago reforms as much as they deride it. And I think the supporters of the consumer welfare standard and others, I think it's important for them to keep that in mind, that in the big scheme of things, the consumer welfare standard is not that old. It's 60 years old, basically, 70 years old. In our country, that's not a very long time. And these things can change very quickly. Sometimes an intellectual debate can happen even within its own silo for a very long time before suddenly bursting out and then suddenly having real changes in the policy world. And so it's important for conservatives and libertarians to take this seriously, to not just laugh at the fact that Lina Khan's FTC has lost these two cases. And if anything, they really lost them on the facts. So the judges in each case said they just did not see evidence of the problems that the FTC was alleging. But that can change over time. The FTC and the neo-Brandesians are surely learning from these defeats. Khan herself has said that these decisions, these losses, are creating a roadmap towards future victories. And so it's important for conservatives and libertarians to take this seriously, not just say, well, these young hipsters don't know what they're talking about. No, they do know what they're talking about. And they may well achieve a revolution similar to the one that preceded them.
And the reason why I wanted to have you on to talk about this, even though really, I mean, I'm not a legal scholar, and is because this seems to be part. What I found really striking reading your article is like it seems to be part of a larger pattern of attacks on the market order, attacks that are that superficially may appear to have nothing to do or have nothing in common with one another, but in fact, they boil down to the same thing. And so I've in mind, to replace shareholder capitalism with stakeholder capitalism, like the ESG debate, the call for common good capitalism instead of just plain old capitalism, the call for protectionism, which is really about who cares about low prices, that free trade brings in low prices for consumers, because what about producers, right? But also industrial policy. Industrial policy is like a lot of it is meant to like revive manufacturing in the face of choices that were made by companies to deliver better, more efficient goods at cheaper price for consumers. And it's this rejection of the consumer, which I find first, a lot of it, right? Protectionism isn't new. Industrial policy is not new. I mean, obviously, common good capitalism is kind of a version of the distributist, right? Thing where, or Robert Reich, railing against Walmart, destroying small businesses. But so this is why I really wanted to have you on is to, it seems this is really part of a trend, a rejection as a consumer as being important, which is weird because producers are consumers too, right? To produce, you need to buy inputs and stuff like this. So anyway, would you agree?
Yeah, I think we're seeing a real generational turn in both the political and ideological arguments. We're seeing underneath that or around that, we're seeing debates over the basic metrics, right? Whether it's stakeholder theory or whether it's the consumer welfare standard and so on. And you're also seeing a change in the basic attitude towards governing institutions and the rule of law. And, I'm for all of our agreements, I don't describe myself as a libertarian for what it's worth. I once upon a time was, and Randy Barnett still hasn't forgiven me for leaving the fold, my friend Randy. I consider myself much more a small R Republican. And so, I sort of hint at this in the article. There are aspects to not so much Kahn, but I think Tim Wu is an interesting writer. I disagree with basically everything, but I think it's interesting in that he does point back to the small R Republican sensibilities that informed the antitrust laws a little over a century ago. And I actually do kind of like that it's good to think about the social impacts of a lot of these arrangements. The rise, I've always thought it's interesting that the rise of sort of administrative government tracked the rise of large corporations in American life in general. I'm not against that. Here I am at the American Enterprise Institute, and I've read Tyler's book in support of big business, and I think that's basically right. But I kind of enjoy the debates, but I end up just profoundly disagreeing where these debates are winding up in many places. And I think above all, for conservatives and libertarians especially, even if we might disagree at the margins on various policies, the one thing that's always sort of bound them together for the last 60 years has always been the focus on the rule of law. And I very much worry about that in an era where our politics is increasingly a war of all against all. I worry that losing these ethics of institutional self-restraint and the rule of law is also happening across the board, not just in antitrust policy, but I think the attacks on current antitrust law and policy are an outgrowth of that moment in our time too.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with you. The thing I will say though is like, I do think it is important that we have conversations about, about communities, about how we organize, about civil societies, about, and what my worry is, in addition to everything you've said, and I think, I mean, I'm a libertarian, but with a conservative sensibility. So I think these are important conversations to be had. My worry, though, is really the government the best at deciding how and how society should be organized, and
Right.
and unfortunately, my experience with government is one where the incentive within governments are just really not good. I mean, it's just kind of, plus, not to mention that I don't believe that the bureaucrats, no matter how smart and Lina Khan and Tim Wu and so many others are remarkably smart, that they can actually kind of overcome the knowledge problem. So in the end, I think it is like you. I think we need to have. I mean, Alienated America, I think, was is a great book by Tim Carney, which talks about a lot of these issues of the disappearance about communities. And let's not even get into the fact that a lot of the disappearance of communities is the product of government intervention in the first place. But I think we must have these conversations, but we must not forget to have also a conversation that says, is really the government the good actor to kind of restore those things? And I find that a lot of people who answer yes are people who actually don't want to do the hard work of persuading people that maybe it is worth kind of living our lives differently or whatever, or like, I don't know, preserving downtown or whatever it is we want to have.
Well, and that's a great point. And it actually brings me back to something you mentioned in passing that I just wanted to get back to. At one point, you said, in many ways, the neo-Brandesian debates are a return to earlier thoughts. And I agree with that. The article was titled "The Power Broke Her." It's a play on the famous book about Robert Moses, The Power Broker. And one of the things I tried to do with that, and by alluding to that book, which is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year, is to point out that, to the extent Robert Moses is remembered today because of that Robert Caro book, he's remembered as this sort of powerful elite that tried to steamroll, plucky folk, neighborhood reformers like Jane Jacobs and others. But the point of Caro's book was actually, and I pepper my article with quotes, is that he was a New Deal reformer. What's the line? He was the optimist of optimists, the reformer of reformers, the idealist of idealists. And as he proceeded in his career overseeing infrastructure in New York State, he decided to basically just to push past legal constraints, not because he was like a nefarious evildoer, but because he thought he was a progressive reformer and that what he was doing, building all these highways and other things, oftentimes just demolishing local communities along the way. He said, well, I'm making the world a better place, and the state will thank me, or they ought to thank me when I'm done. And I think that's largely the attitude of in a way, of what Khan is doing. I quote one line from her Amazon article where she says, sure, Amazon has low prices and consumers seem to like that, but that's not the point, she says. Also, we're seeing at this moment a reform, speaking of the New Deal, a return to sort of the progressive era of pro-infrastructure. For most of my career as an energy lawyer, I always sort of, appreciated the irony that the most pro-infrastructure moment in American history was basically the New Deal and progressives building dams, building highways, building, and all to the tune of a Woody Guthrie soundtrack. And Woody Guthrie would write these New Deal era albums about the Columbia River hydro projects. In the mid-20th century, the 1960s and onward, progressives were often the ones trying to stop building. Now we're in a moment, especially with all the green, the push for green infrastructure, clean energy infrastructure. Suddenly you have a lot of my progressive friends very pro-infrastructure, which I generally like, but really bristling at the legal constraints around government power when it comes to building things. Some of those constraints would frustrate me too when I was on the infrastructure side. But there too, on the infrastructure development side, we see increasingly progressives returning to that earlier 20th century attitude that at the end of the day, a constrained government is a pathetic government, is a cowering government, and that Americans need to trust government to have immense power and discretion. And if Americans won't trust that, well, that's an indictment of Americans and not of the reformers themselves. And I think that's the moment we're entering into right now. Or I guess we're already there.
Mm-hmm. So I have one last question. So looking down the road 25 years from now, what are your expectations of how things on these matters will differ from what they are today?
Well,
you can take it the way you want, whether Lina Khan succeeding or not.
Well, the other big tectonic shift that's happening, and I allude to it in the article, but I'm writing more broadly about it elsewhere, is that at the same moment that the progressive reformers are trying to accomplish these things on antitrust and financial regulation and on energy policy, at the same time, you see an intellectual reform happening in the courts, where courts, judges are reasserting themselves more against agency overreach. And so a lot will depend on how that debate around the courts plays out. But I'll be honest, Veronique, I think one place where I differ from most of my friends and colleagues in the world of administrative law on both the right and the left is at the end of the day, I think a lot of these debates are not really going to be settled by the technocratic reformers or by judges or by administrative law intellectuals. I tend to think that administrative law is usually a tail on a much bigger dog. This was certainly the case in the New Deal and then in World War II. I look at bigger sort of government issues, whether it's this new era of geopolitical competition between the US and China, the technological revolutions around AI and so on. I think those debates are going to, and those not even debate is kind of a stupid way of putting it. Those developments, I think, will have much bigger impacts on the future of administrative law and administrative process. And so I toil away in the field of administrative law. I do love it, and I find it endlessly fascinating. But I think for people in my position, we have to always have humility that at the end of the day, so much of this is going to be determined by much bigger issues. About 5 years ago, I wrote a blog post for the Yale Journal on Regulation. I can't remember what I called it, but I invoked Thomas Kuhn's structure of scientific revolutions. And I said, we should be ready for a huge paradigm shift in administrative law, not because of debates internal to administrative law, but rather that there'll be some external shock or shocks on much bigger substantive issues, geopolitical, national security, cultural, technological, and that those will be what really sets our course for the next generation. And so I think the next 25 years from now, what happens will be determined much more by technological developments and geopolitical developments and cultural developments, all for better or for worse, and that the legal issues will be echoes of that.
Well, this is a great place to end. Thank you so much, Adam, for talking with me.
Oh, my pleasure.